subscribe.
On the 16th of April 2014, passengers on board the South Korean ferry, the Sewol, awoke with a start. The vessel was leaning, very distinctly, to one side, a list that, as the minutes ticked by, only grew more severe. Worried passengers sought help or advice, but there was none to be found. Nothing except a recorded announcement over the ship's public address system, instructing them to remain where they were. Many passengers did exactly this, and, in many cases, this was the worst possible thing they could have been advised to do. The Sewol was launched in Japan in 1994 as the Namanao, a ferry designed to accommodate passengers, vehicles, and a small amount of cargo. For nearly 2 decades it operated without any major accidents. By the time it was sold to the South Korean Heejin Marine Company, it was in need of some repairs and cosmetic improvements after 18 years of use, but was still in good working order. The new owners spent a year refurbishing the vessel, as well as updating interiors and making numerous small repairs. They added a significant number of extra passenger cabins on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th deck. The amount of cargo and passengers she could carry were both increased. All of these changes increased the weight of the ship, and notably most of this extra weight was to be found on the uppermost parts of the ship. To ensure that the Sewol remained balanced when in use, limits were set on the amount of cargo she could carry and the number of passengers. The amount of ballast, that is water stored in tanks low down on the ship to lower its center of gravity and keep it upright, was increased to counteract the added weight above. With these precautions in place, the refurbished ship passed all necessary safety inspections carried out by the Korean Register of Shipping. Declared safe, the ferry entered service on the 15th of March, 2013. She would traverse a route between the port city of Incheon to Jeju Island 3 times a week. This crossing took just over 13 hours to complete, and so overnight sailings were the norm. On the 15th of April 2014, the Sewol's regular departure was delayed by fog, resulting in her leaving port at 9 p.m., about 3 hours later than intended. 476 passengers and crew on board were comfortable enough during the delay. Each passenger had been assigned a simple but comfortable cabin or bunk, and were able to move freely around the vessel. The Sewol was one of the largest ferries in operation in South Korea at the time. Travelers could dine in the onboard restaurant, take in the view from the deck, shop in a small convenience store, or pass the time in a karaoke room. Approximately 250 of the passengers were students on a field trip from Daean, one high school situated just outside of Incheon. They passed the time talking with friends or on their phones. Cell service would be available throughout most of the trip, as the ferry would remain relatively close to the coast. Later in the evening, once the ship departed, passengers were entertained by a small fireworks display arranged on an upper deck, before turning in for the night. By 8:40 and the next morning, many passengers were already awake, anticipating their arrival at Jeju Island in just a few hours. Breakfast was being served in the onboard restaurant, and students were getting dressed and ready for the day ahead. At 8:48 am, however, the ship made an unusually sharp turn. The turn was so abrupt that it caused the vessel to take on a list to port. Cargo in the lower parts of the ship slid along the now sloping deck, accumulating on the port side of the ship, and causing it to list still further. Passengers throughout the ship were alarmed by the sudden tilt, but within minutes, announcements were made telling them to stay calm, stay where they were, put on life jackets, and await further instructions. They duly did so. The recorded message repeated as they waited, and as they waited the list of the ship became more and more pronounced. A side door leading into the cargo bay was now submerged, allowing water to flow in, adding further weight to one side of the ship, and causing the list to accelerate. The Sewol was now beyond the point of being able to right itself. Nothing anyone could now do would prevent it from capsizing. Passenger cabins, however, the instructions to stay put still repeated. Students, many of whom had always been told by parents and teachers to follow instructions in an emergency, did so, although they debated fiercely whether staying put was the right thing to do. Some passengers did ignore the announcement and make their way to the upper decks. The ferry continued to list. A number of small boats, including nearby fishing vessels, had converged on the scene. They would soon be joined by several Coast Guard rescue boats. Small, maneuverable rescue craft approached the floundering ferry, and announcements were made over loudspeaker encouraging passengers gathered on the side of the to abandon ship. More than 100 passengers did so, jumping into the cold water and swimming through the waves to be picked up by rescuers. Those who had followed instructions and remained below decks, however, were now trapped. Even though rescuers had arrived, the ship was now almost completely capsized, with corridors and cabins rapidly filling with water. The window of time during which they could have made their way out had passed. Some passengers had time to realize their situation and send last desperate messages using their cell phones. The very last of these messages was sent at 10:17 am. After this point, there was no further communication with the passengers trapped below decks. By 1:03 p.m. that day, the ship was completely submerged, leaving little hope for survival. Despite this, some media outlets began reporting that everyone on board the Sewol had been rescued. This was not in any way true. 304 of the 476 people who had been on board the ferry had died in the sinking. 8 out of every 10 victims of the disaster were children. In the days that followed the sinking, a massive rescue operation was put into effect, in the hope that there might be some survivors trapped in an air pocket in the overturned ship. This turned out not to be the case, and further to the already insurmountable death toll, several more people died during the rescue and recovery effort. A naval officer died of an injury received during his work, and 2 of the 500 divers who assisted with the operation got into difficulty and passed away. Further, a helicopter returning from the wreck site crashed, killing 5 people. In total then, a further 8 deaths were added to the toll from the sinking itself. In the aftermath of this disaster, an investigation was launched to determine its cause. Over the course of several months, details emerged both about the Sewol and about the conduct of the rescue. It appeared that the Sewol had been significantly less stable than she should have been. The weight of unsecured cargo on board had exceeded the limit that had been set after her refurbishment. Likewise, the amount of ballast had been less than the minimum stipulated, with some ballast tanks emptied in order to make more space for cargo. It also appeared that extra weight in the form of heavy marble fixtures and fittings had been added to some passenger decks after the ferry had been inspected. At least one regular captain of the Sewol had noted that the ship was somewhat unstable, but had believed that this was due to the removal of a side ramp, not due to the excess weight and lack of ballast. Crew training for emergencies had been minimal at the Heejin Marine Company, with 1 year's budget for safety certification being just 2.6 thousand Korean won, the equivalent of about $2. The ferry's unbalanced condition was compounded by the unusually sharp turn it had taken on the morning of the sinking, a turn that may have been the result of a miscommunication. At the controls at the time had been a third mate and a helmsman. The third mate would issue orders to the helmsman, and the helmsman would turn the actual wheel controlling the vessel. The listing began following a standard 5-degree turn ordered by the third mate and carried out by the helmsman. When this caused the ship to begin listing, the third mate ordered the helmsman to turn the wheel in the opposite direction, but the helmsman had already instinctively begun to reverse the turn. Thus, when they followed this order and turned the wheel in the opposite direction, they turned it back the other way, increasing the sharpness of the turn and exacerbating the list. Further to this, once the sinking began, decisive action was not taken. The bridge crew were unable to work the public address system, meaning that no orders could be given to passengers. Instead, a loopy recorded message ordering them to stay put was played. This message had been activated by a communications officer who was not, at the time, well informed about the nature of the emergency. He was worried that passenger movements could further destabilize the already listing ship, and therefore believed that ordering passengers to stay put was a sensible course of action. The bridge crew had called for help, but had not been the first to report the Sewol's distress. One of the one high school students did so by calling the South Korean emergency number 119. This action by a passenger preceded the issuance of a distress call by crew by several minutes. Once the rescue was underway, there was significant confusion. Rescue ships, lifeboat stations, and helicopters were not in direct communication. Crew on board the Sewol communicated via their company's office rather than directly with the Coast Guard in some cases, and the chain of command was frequently uncertain. The Coast Guard, for example, deferred to the judgment of the captain of the Sewol with regards to whether or not to begin an evacuation. The captain believed that the list of the ship made an evacuation impossible, and so delayed ordering one. The Coast Guard failed to overrule him. On top of this, foreign assistance was refused during the disaster, at a time when it may have made a difference to the outcome. Help from the U.S. Navy and from the Japanese Coast Guard was turned down when it was offered in the immediate aftermath of the sinking. The handling of the disaster was the subject of much anger from the general population, anger that was only magnified by evidence that the government wished to control public sentiment about the disaster. For example, it was found that artists who created memorial artworks for those who had died were secretly barred from receiving government grants. Public anger over the response eventually resulted in the resignation of the South Korean Prime Minister and the dissolution of the Korean Coast Guard, with their responsibilities passed to other agencies. Several senior crew members who had been in command on the Sewol that day were given lengthy prison sentences. The captain, who had escaped the ferry even while the recorded message instructing passengers to remain in their cabins continued playing, was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Many questions remain around the sinking of the Sewols. The wreckage of the ferry remains in storage in a harbor in the port of Mokpo. Memorials to the many young lives lost are held every year. Even a decade on from one of the worst ferry disasters in South Korea's history, a sense of loss and betrayal is still keenly felt.